Max Lucado wrote a book entitled, "It's Not About Me." The truth stated in that title is one of the fundamental differences between the two most popular worldviews in our society, that of Christianity and secular humanism. Secular humanism pervades our society. That world teaches that humankind is at the center of the universe. From a philosophical perspective, the universe revolves around us. We are the superior beings in it. Secular humanism teaches there is no God, but if there was a God, it would be us. That worldview has been the driving force behind much of the ungodly legislation that has been adopted in our nation. Since we are the superior beings, we decide that one life's convenience is more important than another life's right to exist. Therefore, we will terminate pregnancies as we choose. As these superior beings, we decide what marriage is and what role gender plays in it. As these superior beings, we determine what gender we are, and we correct any mistake of nature as we see fit. That worldview has influenced our personal philosophies of life as well. It teaches us to put self first, to make happiness our primary goal, to expect the government to serve us, to search for a church that meets my needs, to be loyal only to friends who say what we want to hear, to reject Bible verses that convict us and focus on the ones which affirm us. You see, that worldview takes God out of the center of our lives and puts self in his place. And we have been indoctrinated with that philosophy. A popular comedian named Brian Regan has put together a sketch that is both hilarious and truthful in describing the way that me can sometimes just take over in our lives. Let's watch a couple of minutes of this video.
I'm actually kind of quiet off stage. A lot of people don't realize that. I was at a dinner party recently. A bunch of people that I don't know. One guy talking plenty for everybody. And then me, myself, right? And then I, and then myself, and me. I couldn't tell this one about I because I was talking about myself, and then me. Beware the me monster. So I tried to jump in with a little story. I don't want to just sit there the whole night. Right when I'm done with my story, this guy goes, "That ain't nothing." Oh, well, didn't mean to waste everybody's time telling my nothing story. Here, let Marco Polo speak. He's back with tales of adventure. Why do people need to top other people? I've never understood it, and I see it all the time. Obviously, people get something out of it. At best, people wait for your lips to stop. Yeah, as soon as... Okay, you, me! You, me! You see the difference? You see that? Now I do. What is it about the human condition? People get something out of that. That's why I have a social fantasy. I wish I was one of the 12 astronauts who have been on our moon. They must love knowing they can beat anybody's story whenever they want. They can sit back quietly at a dinner party while some other person, some me monster's doing his thing, and let him go. Let him run with the line while you be quiet. Oh, really? Let him have his moment. Yeah, I'm a big traveler. I have my business. I got my own global enterprise I got to check on. Driving in the Autobahn because I keep a fleet of sports cars over in Zurich. There's a Swiss account that I got to check out. Mount Kilimanjaro expedition, might have to cancel that. Runways in Aspen are a lot shorter the first time you go in there. The Pacific Rim Company are going to try to take that over. Global enterprise. I walked on the moon. Well, you have the floor, Moonwalker. You know, you mentioned driving on the Autobahn. That reminded me. Once I was driving in the Sea of Tranquility. In my lunar rover. And I, too, was worried about our speed till I remembered, wait, we're the only ones on the moon.
Do you know that person, the me monster? Always talking about himself, always topping everyone else's story with his own. It's been said if you cannot identify the me monster in your group of friends, you might be him. Yow. And I guess it's possible for any of us to be that me monster person, right? Because self is such a tempting God. This morning we're going to identify the God of self and find out what we can do to keep that me monster at bay. As human beings, we are naturally self-centered, and that's okay. In fact, I think it's good to some extent that we are. We have strong feelings, for instance, of self-preservation and self-expression and self-actualization. That means the full development of our abilities. Those are good things. They grow out of self-love, which is a healthy mental state for us to have. Jesus said, love your neighbor as yourself. So it's important that we do love ourselves, but how easily that healthy self-love gets out of control and we morph into the me monster. We can so easily become me-focused, putting self first. The 4th edition of Webster's College Dictionary sits in my office, and I refer to it from time to time. It was published in 2001. It lists just over 175 compound words which begin with the prefix self, which in 2001 were a part of our regular vocabulary, words like self-control or self-confidence. But as of May of this year, Wiktionary, the online dictionary, lists over 470 such compound words that begin with self that are a part of our vocabulary. In other words, in the last 21 years, we have almost tripled the number of words we use that begin with self. Self-centeredness is growing. But the truth is, mankind has always struggled with that temptation. Going back to the very first temptation in the Garden of Eden, it was an appeal to self. In that temptation, when Satan spoke to Eve, he used the words you or your 5 times in the 2 sentences he spoke to her. His message was, it's all about you, Eve. You should consider your feelings and your wants and your desires and what's best for you. Think of yourself. And then he clenched the temptation with these words. You shall be as God. And we have battled that temptation ever since. You see, the me monster lives within every one of us. The National Staffing Solutions Company, called Belay, states on their website that they watch for me-focused individuals and refuse to hire them. They describe that in the interview process, they ask a lot of questions and they listen as people talk, and they count how many times a candidate uses the words I, me, or my, and how many times in comparison they refer to other people, and they refuse to hire those who are too self-centered. And I wonder how we would do in those interviews. Let's take a note from that company's practice. In the next non-business email you send, count the number of times you use the word I, my, or me. Now, maybe you don't email. That's kind of passé. Maybe you text and tweet and Facebook message, and those messages are usually more brief, and so the test is a little harder to apply in those cases. So if you really want to know Ask a close friend or a family member to mentally count the number of times you use one of those words in one of your next conversations. You might be surprised. I began doing that in my emails several years ago, counting the number of times I use those words. Now I try to reword my sentences to reduce the number of times those words are used, but it is difficult because I might be a me monster. You can also keep mental track of how much talking you do in a discussion with someone else versus how much listening you do. If you dominate conversations, or if you feel like you have to be heard in every group setting and speak to every topic, or if you can't wait till someone else finishes talking because you have something so important that you need to say, or if you give in to this temptation to story top, you might be a me monster. Here's some sound advice for all of us. Let someone else be the hero in their story. Let another person bask in the glory. Let them get the laugh. If you are always chiming in and taking over the spotlight, people will recognize you as the me monster, and you will be considered a bore. It is better to say little and be considered profound than to say so much that people begin tuning you out. Rick Warren, in his book entitled The Purpose-Driven Life, reminds us, it's not about you. The purpose of your life is far greater than your own personal fulfillment or your peace of mind or even your happiness. It's far greater than your family, your career, or even your wildest dreams and ambitions. If you want to know why you were placed on this planet, you must begin with God. King David of the Old Testament era came to understand that because of God's direct intervention in one point in his life. We're going to take a look at that this morning, and we're going to hopefully learn from David's experience, what he went through and how God directed and led him, how to successfully overcome the god of self. The first thing we need to do is remember who God is. Remember who God is. Let's go to that story found in 2 Samuel chapter 7. The first 2 verses is our beginning. After the king, that is David, after the king was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am, living in a house of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." By this time, David had become greatly successful and easily the most popular person in Israel. That all began when he defeated the giant warrior Goliath as a teenage boy. And then, still as a teenager, he was appointed general over all of Israel's armies. The number one song in Israel at that time was sung about him. It was played on all the radio stations and around Israel. It was the most popular song, the one that people called in and requested the most. Some of the lyrics went like this: King Saul has killed thousands, but David has killed 10,000s. Oh, he was a teenage heartthrob. Shortly afterwards, he replaced Saul as king over Israel. He then led the army in conquest of all of their enemies. He finally, in his last efforts, defeated the city of Jerusalem, took it from an enemy tribe and made it the capital city of the nation. And because of his leadership and his conquest, that city of Jerusalem became known by a nickname. It was called the City of David. The City of David. A huge parade was held to bring the Ark of the Covenant, God's very presence, into Jerusalem. And David was named Grand Marshal. He led the parade in front of everyone. He became the number one celebrity in that nation. Don't you think that this all began to go to his head? As he sat back in his palace, he probably thought, it's good to be king. And so 2 Samuel 7 opens with this picture. The king in his palace. David saw himself as the hero, the deliverer, the protector, the provider. And he was getting dangerously close to elevating himself too highly. After all, he thought he was living better off than God was. God was living in a tent, while he was living in this fine house with cedar-paneled walls. The tent, the tabernacle made of a tent, was the forerunner of the temple. It was a temporary place for the worship of God and for the Ark of the Covenant to be enshrined. David had honorable intentions to build a house, to build the temple for God, but he did not go about it correctly, and he did not go about it with the right heart. It was he who was going to provide for God, just as he had for the nation. I don't think he realized how close he was coming to reversing the roles between him and God. It was as if he had become God's gift to God. And so even Nathan the prophet got caught up in David's persona. When David mused about where he was and how fine his life had become, Nathan responded in verse 3 with these words: "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." You can do it, David. You're a great success. Go for it. It was almost as if Nathan himself didn't remember who God is. But God remembered. And he reminded the both of them in verses 4 and 5 when God spoke to Nathan saying, "Go tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in?" Nathan shouldn't have said, "Do whatever you want, David. God will bless your plans." Instead, he should have said, "Seek what God wants, David, and follow his plans." Did you notice, as we read a moment ago there in verse 5, how God referred to David? Let's look at that again. He called him my servant. He was no longer the king in his palace. It was now my servant David. Has God ever had to take you down a few levels because maybe you thought too highly of yourself? Maybe self was on the throne in your heart instead of God. Maybe you made your own plans, ignoring his. If so, God will remind us, just as he did David, it's not about you. It's about me. Let's read more of God's message to David in verses 8 through 10. "Tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture, from tending the flock, and appointed you ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. And now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men on earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel." God's saying, David, it was me all along. It wasn't you. I was there providing the power. I was there providing the victories. It was me. You were just a shepherd boy, David, when I took you out of those hills. And if not for me, you'd still be in those hills, picking sheep manure out of your sandals. If we were to go on reading, God referred to himself in that first person pronoun 22 times. There's a message there. It was me, David, not you. I gave you your abilities. I gave you your opportunities. I gave you those victories. And there's a message in those words for us as well. When we begin to think too highly of ourselves, God reminds us, "You are my servant." Like David, our abilities and opportunities and victories are gifts from God. We should not point to them to demonstrate how great we are. Instead, we should point to them to demonstrate how great God is. And so remember who God is. And secondly, remember to consult God about his plans before making your own. It turns out God did already have a plan in mind for the construction of the temple. He revealed that in verses 12 and 13 of this chapter when he said, "When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name." And that son of David that did that son that God chose was Solomon. And Solomon did build the temple, and he spared no expense. It was an exquisite temple which honored God greatly. And perhaps it was that while Solomon was building the temple, or shortly after it was constructed, he remembered this story about this wish that his father had and this conversation between God and David. For much later in his life, Solomon wrote these words in Psalm 127:1. "Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain." You see, it's all about God. So remember who God is. Remember to consult him about his will. And thirdly, remember to submit to him as God, following his plans. You see, as it turns out, God's plan was not for David to build God's house, but for God to build David's house. God said those very words in verse 11 when he said, "The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you." He was going to establish David and build his dynasty. There's a principle that's taught to us here, and it's this: before we can build God's house, he must build ours. He must build our life. He must transform our character. He must enable us in our abilities. He must transform us and mold us and make us to what he needs us to be. That is my weekly prayer. I pray every Sunday before I preach, and I pray as I am preparing this sermon and doing other ministry, God, this is your thing. It's not about me. I am merely a tool in your hand. You are the master craftsman. Mold me to fit in your hand. Mold me to fit the purpose that you are calling to me to do. And may the victory be yours. May the glory be yours. Before coming to this church, we ministered to a church just outside of Hartford, Connecticut. I worked hard at that ministry, knocking on every single door in every neighborhood that surrounded that church building, inviting the people to church. I counted up, there was over 2,000 doors that I knocked on, meeting people and inviting them to come to our church and find Jesus. We grew Bible studies in that church from 0 to about 10 or 12. We implemented a discipleship training program to help people grow in their faith. We reached into the black and the Jamaican and the deaf communities. We cast a vision for what the future could look like if we stepped out on faith. The church grew a little, but it did not become sustainable. About 10 years after we left, that church died. They called me back to preach its final sermon. It was heartbreaking. I felt like a failure in that ministry. I had not built the Lord's house solidly enough to weather the coming storms. But in the years since, I have come to realize that God had a different plan for that ministry. God took me to that church to form me. He had me work with men in that church who were captains of industry so that I could learn leadership. He had me work alongside greatly talented musicians so I could see what inspirational worship looks like. He had me preach to highly educated people so I could take preaching to the next level. He gave me a strong work ethic, making me work hard to be successful at all in that church so that I would have a strong enough work ethic for the next ministry. He built my house so I could move to northeastern Ohio, where a small church was struggling to survive, and build his house. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. This church's success is not about me. I am nobody. Just someone who lets God work through him. It is always about God. But if in your mind it is about me, you like me or you like my abilities, then you are coming to church for the wrong reason. For it is always about God. I want to encourage you to let God work in your life, transforming you and molding you and making you to be what he needs you to be. Let him build your house, for he has great plans for your future to build his. We must humble ourselves before God. It's interesting and important for us to note that after God spoke to David, David reacted in the right way. Let's read that in verse 18. Then King David went in and sat before the Lord. He sat before God, a sign of humility in God's presence. He could have felt insulted or offended. You don't want my gift? What, I'm not good enough to build a temple for you? But that would have been his ego talking. Ego is easily offended. Ego gets angry and holds grudges. Instead, David prayed this prayer in verses 18 through 22. Who am I, sovereign Lord? And what is my family that you have brought me this far? And as if this were not enough in your sight, sovereign Lord, you have also spoken about the future of the house of your servant. And this decree, sovereign Lord, is for a mere human. For the sake of your word and according to your will, you have done this great thing and made it known to your servant. How great you are, sovereign Lord. There is no one like you. Don't you see a different attitude? Don't you see a different spirit? You alone are God, David said. It's all about you. I am nothing without you and your grace. David was very much like us, far from perfect. There were several sins, and a few of them were atrocious that he committed. But David always humbled himself when he was convicted and repented. And so he modeled for us the way to approach God in humble submission, recognizing him as God and seeking his grace. And so he invites you this morning to recognize him as God. Humble yourself before him. Confess your sins and ask for forgiveness and seek his grace if you've never done that before. He wants you to be his servant.